100 years ago today, Virginia Woolf published her masterpiece, Mrs Dalloway, at Hogarth Press on the 14th of May 1925. And now 100 years on, it is not only my favourite book of all time, but so many people's. And I want to share a little bit about my love of this book today, as well as taking you on a little bit of my Mrs Dalloway walk in dedication to Mrs Dalloway and Virginia Woolf. But in a very Mrs Dalloway way, in order to explain my present love of this book, we have to go to the past to tell you a little bit more about the context. Controversially, when I first read Mrs Dalloway, I wasn't sure what to make of it, and I didn't think I liked it. But as time went on, certain metaphors and images came back to me from the novel, and I kept thinking about them. I was consumed by the memories of reading this book in the same way the characters are consumed by their own past, until I finally decided that I had to read it again, otherwise this novel would haunt me. Every time I would walk up the stairs, Mrs Dalloway would be staring back at me. And I read it, and it was like, not to be dramatic, it's like when you read something for the first time and you realise you've been holding your breath for the entire novel. Everything makes sense. The beauty in the book, the description, the meaning, the complexity, the challenge in some ways as well that it gives you as a narrative was everything I've ever wanted in a novel, as well as being a description of a city I love so much. There is something about this book that over the years it has formed a tapestry of my life and my identity as a reader. It is something that when I read the book, I then knew before even going off to university that this was going to be the book I did my dissertation on as an undergraduate. And I did. And even despite studying it and reading it 20 times for university and studying it at university before my dissertation, every time I came out with a passion for it that I have never felt with any other book. Every time I go into it, there is something different. When Virginia Woolf was writing Mrs Dalloway, she said that she was stuffed with ideas. She felt like she could put everything she'd experienced in life into this book. She was overflowing with it. She plunged into the thick of writing this book. And that is how I feel sitting here thinking about filming a video. Every single time I've picked up Mrs Dalloway, there's been something different as a theme, as a topic, an image that I didn't quite notice the first time catches me off guard. And then you realise the cleverness of this design that Virginia Woolf put together and created with this novel. I am just stuffed with too many ideas to explore in one video, but I wanted this video to be a celebration of this novel. After all, this is Mrs Dalloway's party and you are invited. The edition that I've been mostly reading for this celebration has been the Vintage Classics kind of reprint really of the original printing of Mrs Dalloway with the Vanessa Bell cover. Even the nods to the kind of the colour of the end papers are taken from the inspiration of the first edition. To say I love this edition and this cover is an understatement because it connects me with the readers who first read Mrs Dalloway and first had that experience, and also kind of to Virginia Woolf herself. Now I'd like to introduce you to my original edition of Mrs Dalloway. It is slightly broken. It has been sellotaped many times, and even after reading it this morning before work, it is falling apart even more. But it contains all of my dissertation annotations and also new annotations that I made this morning because I really wanted to try and read it in one day, which I have done, before I go on my own Mrs Dalloway walk and buy some flowers. But I think I'm going to be buried with this book. If I was in a fire, I would save it. It means so much to me, and I think when I was kind of thinking about talking about Mrs Dalloway for this anniversary, I realised how much of myself is in these pages, of my memories of either studying it or just living with this book. It's a book that I've read every year, multiple times a year, since I very first read it, way over 10 years ago now. So I have seen myself grow up in the pages of this book. And have had the best moments and also probably the worst moments within its pages. Another really special edition I'd like to share with you is my folio, because I bought this actually at Charleston Farm on my very first trip down to Sussex to see Virginia Woolf's house, Monk's house, and Charleston Farm, which is the home of Vanessa Bell. Not only are the illustrations in this folio edition really beautiful, and I treasure this book so much, I remember really clearly looking at the cover and thinking about Bloomsbury. And I remember also my first ever trip to Bloomsbury in 2015 and having that slight moment in my head of wondering about whether I would have wanted to live in London. Could I live in London? And now, even though I don't even live in London anymore, I still regularly, one, do Mrs Dalloway's walk, but also visit Bloomsbury. And I spent a lot of time in Gordon Square, Tavistock Square, and just the general Bloomsbury area because it means a lot to me. I sit in the same benches that I remember sitting in on my first visit to Bloomsbury, and I see an image of my younger self, and I am flooded by memories as I walk in the area of how much I have grown up since then and moved on since that very first trip, and the person I was when I first read Mrs Dalloway. So in the same way that the novel of Mrs Dalloway, her progression across London, and also not only her progression but Septimus's and Peter and Hugh and Richard, all of their kind of lives are haunted by the past in good ways and in bad, and their progress throughout the city is also their progress through their own minds and their own memories. And in the same way, that's the experience I have in London too. And I wonder if my experience of the city has been so profoundly shaped by my love of the novel and of Virginia Woolf's heightened perceptions and feelings of the world that she inhabited, and whether that has informed me as a person. I'm not going to show you every edition of Mrs Dalloway because that would honestly be a video on its own, a complete video. But I did want to share with you this book, which is my SB books, the notebooks of Virginia Woolf, which is the manuscript of Mrs Dalloway. It is the manuscript of The Hours, the book that became Mrs Dalloway. When Virginia Woolf set out to kind of write Mrs Dalloway, it started as short stories that then became the novel. And so a really beautiful moment in this book for me, one is just seeing Virginia Woolf's handwriting, her marginalia, the notes she was making, kind of little reminders to herself. There's a lot of sums going on in the corners of these books. There's a really beautiful moment for me in this book. She ends it with the famous kind of end line of "For there she was." And then on the next page, Virginia Woolf starts again. She notes down in her diary that it was a feat to find the final words, and then she started again from the very beginning. And I think that in itself sums up, so much of Mrs Dalloway. She's presenting the reader, Clarissa, as a complete being, but actually throughout the novel she's in fragmented pieces from memories and how people view her, and at the end we have a complete whole and we are given her in exactly the same way that in the novel Clarissa talks about how she gives her parents her complete life in her hand and offers it to them and says, "This is what I've made of it." The novel ends with Virginia Woolf presenting Clarissa, for there she was, to us, the reader. So just as we are presented Mrs Dalloway, she's kind of undone again, and she goes back into the past with the first line of the novel. I think one of the greatest lines in all of literature. Mrs Dalloway said she would buy the flowers herself. As I said, every time I read Mrs Dalloway, something else sticks out to me, and this time it was just simplicity of the first line. Mrs Dalloway said she would buy the flowers herself. As the reader, we now know what Virginia Woolf's present is going to look like, or future is going to look like, the present moment of her leaving the house and going to buy the flowers. But the first line is in past tense. Mrs Dalloway said she'd buy the flowers herself. So even the present moment is mixed up in the past. So then a few lines down where we get taken into her past at Boughton and we are plunged into the open air at Boughton. How fresh, how calm, stiller than this, of course, the air was in the early morning. We've already from the first line been prepped by Virginia Woolf that we are going to be moving from the present to the past in a fluid way, just like the waves of her novel, just like the leaden circles that dissolve in the air. There is something mobile about time with Virginia Woolf, and that presence, I guess the thing I really like about this novel is how and it's also something that people do tend to sometimes struggle with, is the idea of you're not quite sure where you are, how far you've gone back, who's speaking. But in a way, I think that is the joy in the novel for me, because the past is so present that they're indistinguishable sometimes. And the fact that in a way that shows us what we are as humans. Like, my past has made my present. Like, I would not be who I am without the context of my life before this present moment. So as the characters move across the city, their pasts follow them. In A Sketch of the Past, Virginia Woolf notes, "In certain memorable moods, memories which one had forgotten come to the top." So even in Virginia Woolf's own life and in her writing, she views the past as something that has its own existence and can come to the top at any moment and therefore forms your being. I also find it really interesting that the title of the novel moved from The Hours to Mrs Dalloway, and I think that's symbolic of Miss Dalloway is the hours. Mrs Dalloway is built of everything that happened in her day and everything that happened in her past. It didn't need to be called the hours because that is what the character represents, because we're all made up of the hours of our lives, I guess. The whole novel is structured by the hours, the passing of time, and the sound of Big Ben. For having lived in Westminster how many years now? Over 20. One feels even in the midst of traffic or waking at night, Clarissa was positive. A particular hush or solemnity, an indescribable pause, a suspense, but that might be her heart affected, they said, by influenza, before Big Ben strikes. There, out it boomed, first a warning, musical, then the hour, irrevocable. The leaden circles dissolved in the air. The Hours takes us from 10 a.m, a beautiful June morning in London, to Mrs Dalloway's party, because we can't forget. We must remember Mrs Dalloway's party. But from the very beginning of the book, the countdown to Mrs Dalloway's party is also a countdown, the passage of time, and it's tinged with death, for whom the bell tolls. The fact that the first strike of Big Ben acts as a warning. In the annotation, Miss Dalloway, it says that Big Ben was silent for a few years in the war. So in fact, the indescribable pause and the suspense is also the fear of the war. It's, will that silence happen again? And that silence denotes war. So even though Mrs Dalloway is able to calm herself and, say the war was over, that lingers in, that past moment lingers in. You also have not only, I guess, the world history, the country's history of the war in that moment, you also have a personal history of, but that might be her heart affected, they said, by influenza. So there's the mix of the kind of world past with the personal past. But including both of them together is also something that Virginia Woolf does a lot, and she does it in A Room of One's Own. And I guess looking at the impact of the small, intimate things in daily life and equating them with massive kind of world events and markers of time like war. And actually for Mrs Dalloway, her life, her illness is as big of a marker as the war itself. But then when you go over to the character of Septimus Warren Smith, the shell-shocked soldier, you have the bell symbolising the passing of time, the moving forward of time, and ultimately death. And the countdown is not to a party, but it's to his own suicide. As the characters move across the city in the novel, the bells of Westminster and Big Ben is kind of one of those external points where the novel kind of references and kind of grounds us in this moment whilst also dragging us back into the past. But I think when you look at Clarissa Dalloway and then you look at Septimus Warren Smith, when Virginia Woolf was talking and planning Mrs Dalloway, she talked about the idea of there being, wanted to show sanity and insanity. And so these different points of reference, the physical things that are happening in the novel, are viewed very differently. The way that, the car backfires in Mrs Dalloway, and Mrs Dalloway knows that it's a car backfiring, even though it makes her jump. Whereas that's a very different response to Septimus. When you have the aeroplane in the writing in the sky, Septimus thinks it's writing to him, whereas Mrs Dalloway is wondering what people are kind of looking at. There is a connection between them by looking at these external factors, but their lives are so different, and even though they're having the same experiences, they're viewing it really differently. I think the other theme in the novel that I wrote on a lot of my dissertation was this communication that constantly fails and never quite gets there. It's almost like how Peter Walsh is constantly opening his pocket knife as if to make an action, but he never does. He opens it and closes it. There's so many missed opportunities of these kind of characters connecting with each other. And there's a lot of also talk about what communication is, and the fact that death itself is kind of brought to the novel as an act of communication where all else has failed. Another thing I picked up when reading this novel this time round was just the pure amount of repetition that again forms, I guess, the whole structure of the novel, but also the idea of doubling and viewing it as sanity versus insanity. You have, fear no more the heat of the sun, the way Mrs Dalloway takes it, and then the way that it actually forms Septimus's final act as well. Whenever I'm reading any piece of Virginia Woolf's work, I always return to A Writer's Diary, which is an edited collection of her diaries, obviously about her writing, which was collated by Leonard Woolf after Virginia Woolf's death. And even though upon her death Virginia Woolf requested that all of her papers be burnt, thank God Leonard didn't listen. We love you, Leonard, we owe you an awful lot. But she said this in 1923 about the hours, and I think this is also key to everything I love about the novel, and also a few of the things I picked up from reading this time. I should say a good deal about the hours and my discovery. How I dig out beautiful caves behind my characters. I think that gives exactly what I want. Humanity, humour, depth. The idea is that the caves shall connect and each come to daylight at the present moment. For me, those caves in Mrs Dalloway are their memories, their ambitions, and as they go across the city, they all connect and come to daylight, and as they're moving around, we get an insight into their interior lives. In A Writer's Diary, Virginia also said, "The task of a writer is to go beyond the formal railway line of a sentence, and to show how people feel or think or dream all over the place." And that is, I think, why her novels are so masterfully done, and the design of them is so important. And even though it can sometimes mean that they're more potentially confusing to read, the beauty is in that confusion. I know that a lot of things I'm referencing as kind of things of interest to me reading it this time are kind of nod to death, really, whether it's the failure of communication or the passing of time or just, I guess, the motifs in general. But actually for me, this is a novel about life. At the same time there is a death in Mrs Dalloway, there's also a party. They're infinitely connected, they can't be separated. What is this terror? What is this ecstasy? He thought to himself. What is it that fills me with extraordinary excitement? It is Clarissa, he said, for there she was. The beauty of Virginia Woolf's writing is that you can pick several lines in this novel and feel that the entirety of the novel is contained within them. Again, they are a gift to the reader, presenting the novel to us at all times. And this for me is the key thing. What is this terror? What is this ecstasy? Life is frightening. It's dangerous to live even for one day. It's the fact that actually for Septimus the ecstasy was in death. In Clarissa it is in her party. It's the choice between life and death, and she chooses life. Arguably she's going back to Peter and Sally, back to her past. Is that a future, or is she returning back to a safety within? Is the present that contains Miss Kilman the terror for Clarissa? Is death the final act of communication for Septimus? Ecstasy? It's no mistake that the first image we have of young Clarissa is opening the window and plunging into the open air. And then one of Clarissa's last thoughts about Septimus is whether he plunged out of the window holding his treasure. Terror and ecstasy within the novel fill Peter with this extraordinary excitement in the way that both life and death does for us, the reader, and also to Virginia Woolf as a writer. When I thought about all of the ways I wanted to celebrate today and mark these 100 years, I turned to A Writer's Diary to see how Virginia Woolf spent the day. And as always, she was on to the next thing. This is going to be fairly short, to her father's character and complete in it, and mother's and St Ives and childhood. And all the usual things I try to put in. Life, death, etc. What I like about this line in The Writer's Diary is that she's kind of showing the tunnelling process behind her characters, and life and death are just the usual things. They're the foundation. The other little kind of identifiers of the characters are there, but the foundation, as always, is life and death. As I said at the beginning of this video, I am stuffed with ideas about Mrs Dalloway, but I think the one thing I would love everyone to take away, if you haven't yet read it, or if you have read it and this is me kind of persuading you about its brilliance, is that it's a novel about life and joy, and it's an offering. You know, there's loads of descriptions of offerings and gifts and pleasure and excitement and life and laughter and human relationships and beauty, and also the fragility of all of those things. And it's a novel that I think contains not only the love of the city. I think there's no coincidence by the fact that, you know, this novel was started in Richmond but then finished in Tavistock Square, where Virginia was really happy, kind of moving from the suburbs of, well, I guess London in Surrey, as it probably was then, to the centre of a thriving city again, and being where she was happy, and then also obviously spending time in Sussex. This is a novel that is Virginia Woolf at her very best, but also getting to understand herself even more as a writer, and then kind of led her on to her later works as well. Just like Mrs Dalloway, I will be walking across the city that I love to buy flowers, and as I walk I will be met by all my previous selves that have done this walk and spent time in this city, from going to university, falling in love, and spending so many hours just imagining what my life would be, and now realising the person that I am and what's to come next. So I hope you enjoy the end of this video and my walk, and I hope that you read Mrs Dalloway and that you love it. If you don't love it, that's also fine, we just might not be able to be friends. Thank you all for watching and for celebrating 100 years of Mrs Dalloway with me. I'm now back from buying my flowers and I realise I've got an Emily Bronte mug. I really should have got my Virginia Woolf mug out. One thing I have to say though is when I was reading in the park, there was a propeller playing overhead, just like in Mrs Dalloway, and then the minster kind of, you know, chimed just like Big Ben, and I had that moment when I was like, am I in the novel? And it was just beautiful. And so I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you are with me at the end, please leave me a bouquet of flowers, and I hope that you buy some flowers yourself. I'll see you next time. Bye!